Thanks everyone for tuning in. My name is Dena Beard. I'm the director of The Lab, and I'm broadcasting to you live from The Lab right now, and this should be going live to YouTube as well. So hello, and The Lab, I should remind everyone, sits on Ramaytush Ohlone land, unceded land, and we extend our gratitude and respect to the many Indigenous people who have stewarded this land for generations. And we have reconfigured the lab over the past 6 years to kind of redirect our ideology and thinking around this interest of dismantling systems of perception. And what we mean by that is really trying to give artists complete and total freedom to reconfigure the way that we experience art. So we give artists up to $100,000 each in funding, keys to our space, total option to revise any and all aspect of our operations. At least that's the hope. And we want to know how far they can take that challenge and how much we can revise the lab to kind of fit the needs of the art making process itself. And really we're trying to figure out in that, like, how do we make a space where the art itself can come to exist in the fact that it's a shared practice between the audiences and the artists themselves. So we used to do this through direct experiences of art, of course, with collective bodies in space. And now, as we're all thrown into the virtual sphere, we're trying to replicate that online, perhaps unsuccessfully, perhaps stilted, though I think Luis might fix that for us this time.
I wish.
But we really do need your participation as audience members. So please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I think it's down there to ask questions. And I'll field those to Luis at the end of the talk. If you're on YouTube, you can use the comment section there as well. As a reminder, the lab does offer real-time translation services, live closed captioning, but we do ask that you request that in advance. Please reach out to us at TheLabSF at thelab.org, and we will make any arrangements that are at all possible. For now, we will put a link in the chat to a web transcription service. So just super excited to have Luis Camnitzer here with us tonight. Luis was born in Germany in 1937, grew up in Montevideo, Uruguay, and has lived and worked in New York since 1964. Luis doesn't see any real distinction between his work making objects, teaching art, or writing, and many other practices that he considers to be a part of this project. All are a part of his work investigating how power is exercised and can be challenged in society. He interrogates the power structures inherent to the practice of art at the same time as he explores its liberating potential. So if what we talk about tonight resonates with you at all, I encourage you to go to Printed Matter's website and order Luis's book, this book itself. One number is worth one word. I will put a link to that as well later on in the talk. There's just a wealth of ideas available there and a huge kind of lexicon of understanding Luis's thought process. Hopefully, what we were talking about before is that this becomes contagious and viral and everybody goes off and rethinks the entire pedagogy of art as a result. But we will see. So, hi, Luis. Thanks for joining.
This is not a book presentation or book sale session. No,
not at all.
That's clear.
Just a very nice compendium of ideas.
Okay.
Yeah. So with that said, I notice that you often bristle at the way that people introduce you.
Yes.
Either as an artist or a sculptor, printmaker, conceptualist, all of these ridiculous terms we slap onto this idea of the artist in all of its systems. But I have noticed that you usually describe yourself as an ethical anarchist. I think that's a commitment we share. So do you think you can define that or explain what that means to you?
Well, the problem is that language is controlled and tends to, by those who control it, usurp meanings. Mm-hmm. And anarchist by now has become, for self-interest of other people, a synonym of terrorism and subversion, where subversion is another example. of usurping. The subversion basically means reordering or challenging an order, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I add the word ethical to anarchism to reclaim ideologies held by Bertrand Russell, by Herbert Reed, by Kropotkin, by Martin Buber, all high-level intellectuals that were not interested in bombing the world, but in improving it. And I think it clarifies until ethics are usurped as well and turned into some crime, and you go to jail for that. But for the moment, ethics seems to be the only territory we have left for resistance. So I try to underline that and protect it.
I like that very much. Yeah, there's a great quote in your book somewhere. In the restricted definition of art, that essay, I think that's from 1992. You say that no system is interested in creating critical citizens. Critical citizens are created spontaneously in spite of educational systems, whether implemented by the ideological right or the ideological left, rather than because of them. And I think that's really like it really pinpoints kind of this idea that no system that we create can create the perfect critical system. Once we get to that, it's similar to your idea of utopia. Once we get to the point of having this kind of formulated viewpoint of what people are able to name their function in society, then we've kind of ruined the process itself. Is that right?
Yeah, well, you freeze it into an object and gives the object, instead of stimulating generative process of knowledge. So, I mean, you see that in education by now. Again, the word is usurped. Education today means training, not educating. And nobody's called on that. And art is synonym of art object and not of method of generating meanings and processing and expanding knowledge. So all those things have to be called and try to redress them, to reactivate them. And art is a great field to do that. Art, not capitalized, but small, because it's a interdisciplinary meta-discipline for knowledge, which you can explore in all directions, not just logical and rational, but you can use imagination without boundaries. And then you negotiate that with reality to see what can you do and what not, and why can't you do it, and what are the obstacles, and who puts them there, and whose interests are they serving. And therefore, art is an intrinsically political action, regardless ideology. It's just there politically. Makes it interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah, and this idea of, I mean, to come to this ambiguous word that we use all the time called art, and that we slap on pretty much everything, irregardless of value. But I think back constantly to a forum we had a few months ago with the Indonesian collective Ruang Grupa. Ruang Grupa are going to be curating the next Documenta, remarkably, and they, in the forum that they spoke about how in the archipelago of Indonesia there are hundreds and hundreds of language, but there's not a single word for art. Art is so embedded in every aspect of daily life that they don't need a term for it.
Well, not only that, by giving it a name, you are making it harmless. And that's the point.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can all acknowledge that it's a pretty ambiguous term, but you talk about art as a problem-solving tool, like you have in the past, an attitude, which I really, really appreciate, this idea of art as an attitude rather than as a discipline or as a product of consumption specifically. It is a way of decoding systems that we live in. Can you talk a little bit about this idea of art as the coding and decoding aspects of art?
Yeah, it's probably more disarticulating and articulating than decoding. I used coding and decoding when in college, when I was teaching, I tried to put in line English as a second language courses with art, and make the parallel of, we have a code, we have to learn how to decode it and then recode it in an understandable way. And therefore art is like a second language as well, and we have to handle it. And I wished that we all were in one department, which I wasn't allowed to do. In any case, it is really to get out of orderly systems and see why are they there, who determines that they are orderly, and what possibility is there to reorder them or to mix orders which are supposedly not legal in terms of the mixture. And from there, create knowledge. And I think that's a function of art. So it's independent of craft. I think one problem we have is that the history of art is so bound with artisanry that we forget that the art part is not in the making, but in the extra, in the plus. It's like crafts plus or artisanry plus. And that's really what we are starting to understand since mid-20th century, when we don't deal anymore with art as an hedonistic proposal, but as a form of formulating and solving problems. And then today, that allows you to revise art history from that point of view and determine what artists of the past are handling problems that are relevant today and which are not. And so I have issues with Michelangelo and a lot of Renaissance people that are sold to us, but are basically incredibly craftsmen, solving in the plus area issues that are of no relevance to me personally. So it's a very personal take. While other people, and I take Alejandrinho as an example, he was a Brazilian sculptor of the 18th century, who is as skillful, if you want, as Michelangelo, but there's a potency and then anti-colonialism in the religious sculptures he did, which still resonates today. And that allows you to revise art history and reassemble the values and take them out of the hegemonic canonic system and see what part of the canon holds up and what part of the canon has to be demolished. So it's not that the canon is wrong, it's just that it's as it is, it's a package that not necessarily serves our interests.
Yeah, I've seen so much of this kind of different institutions in the Bay Area specifically kind of closing down on this idea of a hegemonic definition for art, but also for all kinds of liberal arts studies or kind of critical practices. When I was at UC Berkeley as a curator at the museum there, they started this operational excellence project, which is basically decimating all the liberal arts practices and departments and taking away a lot of the kind of critical thinking functions, really reducing it down to the STEM field of research that we all know. And, we understand kind of what that means. I think we all nationally understand what that means as a kind of a mode of kind of consolidating a canon or idea or a hegemonic view of things. But we've also seen on the other side of the token, these situations with art schools, and specifically right now we're dealing with the potential closure of SFAI, or certainly the dissolution of San Francisco Art Institute. And San Francisco Art Institute is 150 years old. It's been on the brink of closure many times in the past due to financial and structural mismanagement. I think you and I both agree that art schools are kind of caught up in a pyramid scheme where the majority are left without work. The majority of students are left without work as artists, and those who do kind of slide through have to kind of be reinvested back into the pyramid scheme as teachers. And this kind of cycle continues in this relentless pace. And yet, even under this kind of diabolical system, there is some liberatory potential there. There's something happening that brings people back, that keeps people invested in it. And certainly, we saw the situation with SFAI where they gathered this reimagining committee together. And this is what brought me to your book, actually, is I was sitting on a subcommittee in the reimagining committee that was for governance specifically. And we were thinking about how to re-envision the school from the ground up, create cooperative leadership structures, base it around fair pay, equity, collective pedagogy, free tuition, all of these things that we were hoping for. Of course, it wasn't accepted by the board, and there was no real board response at that point. But the idea was still there, and it seemed to be economically viable from what we kind of put together. But it reminded me, I just think it's pretty remarkable what you're able to do with your peers in Montevideo, completely and totally reforming the school at the time in 1960, right? And I was just, and you kind of in your manifesto, or in that piece of writing that you produced, you kept reiterating that we should only be producing art when everybody in society has the possibility of doing so, which I think is wonderful. And that sentiment, I think, should run through everything that we're trying to do, at least every attempt that we make to create some sort of artistic pedagogy. So can you kind of outline what happened there in Montevideo?
Well, it was a bust.
It
was a total bust because it became institutionalized. And when we started teaching, there was an initial commitment that came from the student body that we should only be on faculty for 5 years and make sure during those 5 years that we trained a new generation of faculty. So make it a pedagogical lab at the same time it was an art school. And that didn't work. It didn't work for mainly economic reasons and laziness. So people stayed on the job. I was lucky that I got a grant and came to the US. I mean, not that I came to the US, but I got a grant to leave. Therefore, I didn't have to sit for the exam. Would I try to stay longer or not? I just left in time and can claim I accomplished what I promised, which was not to stay 5 years. But it is a problem. It's a problem here too. It's a tenure problem. I'm basically against tenure. And actually I got it by accident, which was nice, because if I had to fight for it, I wouldn't have known what to do. And I got it because the institution forgot that I had previous teaching years. And by the time they realized it, they were legally bound to give me tenure. So it was like a gift. So I didn't have to think about it. But it ended up with having a department that was top heavy and old. And at the same time, you cannot just dismiss people after whatever, 5 years or 7 years. So, okay, go find another job. So it's a conundrum and it doesn't have a real solution. So I empathize with the faculty that stayed on. What I didn't empathize with when I went back in '69 after 5 years of absence, I realized that they were still doing the same assignments for the students that we had developed 9 years earlier. And that was unforgivable. And at that point, we broke, and we only now, a couple of years ago, resumed contact, but there's a new generation there. But it is a problem with vertical meritocratic systems and basically authoritarian systems in which faculty gets paid and students do not get paid, although they work as hard or harder than the faculty because they give up other working conditions. So salary should be evenly distributed. And then you start having a non-authoritarian relation. But as long faculty gets paid and students don't, no matter what the faculty says, they are in an authoritarian position, even if they claim they are not. And that's an embedded problem. It's like part of the hidden curriculum. And that has to be analyzed. So in art school, you have the same. You have conflicts about mentorship, how is the authority of mentorship, who has the right to be a mentor, who not, how much do you develop team or peer judgment, how honest is peer judgment. I mean, it's a holy mess. And that mess comes because you're trying to filter out those few people that may make it into a gallery and ultimately into a museum, which is where our posterity lives. So we're working for the past of the future people. That's an awkward situation.
It's tremendously
a
awkward.
social situation.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, do you have any advice, or do you even think it's possible to create an art school, a valuable art school under capitalism, under the conditions in which we live now?
It depends what you call valuable. I mean, obviously it is valuable for the system. Galleries go to art schools already to grab promising talent before they graduate and have them cheap. So it works. It works on that level. It screws up all the students that pay for that filter and don't get through it. But within the system, it works. So it's a decision. I mean, if somebody wants to try to be a professional artist, it's their business. When I had, hold on, hello?
I forgot.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
I had warned my son. But where was I? The real thing is that art, the same as reading and writing, or writing and reading, which I prefer, is a must for everybody. But ultimately, it makes you functional in a society in which orders are exchanged. Art, thinking in terms of art, or the art methodology, should be integrated to the whole educational system, regardless if eventually you become a professional or not. That's like a secondary, separate problem. Okay, I always say, not everybody who learns how to write is intended to get a Nobel Prize, and nobody expects that. So not everybody who can think artistically, that is, imagine creatively and critically without boundaries, is bound to land in a museum. But they're bound to be better citizens because they're going to contribute instead of just following orders. So the function of a professional art school could be embed a pedagogical aspect so that those people that graduate from there do not focus so much on the gallery, but focus how to improve the educational system and apply their refined talents to stimulate other people, not by consumption, but by activating thought and feel processes that make them full people. And then we have an educational system and not a training system.
That's absolutely fantastic, especially right now. I think we're in a critical moment, you know, we're starting to rethink a lot about all of our educational systems. And
Well, we're in a moment in which STEM is taking, I mean, STEM start is not a new thing. They dated in the 90s, but STEM really started in a rampant way with Sputnik, when the US was afraid that Soviet Union might be ahead. And then it was strengthened further with Reagan, with the Nation at Risk manifesto, which was fabricated, but was justifying the technological training versus the education, and slowly was killing all the liberal arts and humanities and art, first of them. And it's not that I think that humanities are taught well, but at least they give a space to think and to speculate, which technology doesn't. So now the word creative is transposed from art making and philosophy into applying it to instrumentality and make it profitable. And we slowly will forget that creativity means to generate something and not to reassemble things that are there to make them better functioning. And we don't understand that functionalism in itself is really an insidious aesthetic, which we take for granted. And it's an economical movement that is translated into formalism. And I don't know. I mean, the fight is not making it decorative, but the fight is to rethink that, at least to be aware when a functional design is an economic device that takes an aesthetic form, and when does it generate knowledge. I'm fascinated that art, I'm sorry.
No, please.
No, art schools tend to merge art and design.
Mm-hmm.
And don't realize that they're opposite in terms of knowledge. That a design problem deals with the solution that is embedded in the problem, while an art problem is looking for a solution outside. So one is centripetal and the other one is centrifugal. So they are at odds with each other. A good designer is not necessarily a good artist, nor vice versa. And yet, foundation courses in art tend to be design assignments and not art assignments, because nobody really focused on what they're doing. That's rather annoying. It's not annoying in terms of developing professionals. It's annoying in terms of developing a functional citizen.
Absolutely. The difference between creating products that are easily consumable or usable, or kind of, we don't have to be hyper aware of all the time, versus reverse engineering. You know, the function of the artist is kind of reverse engineering everything to make us more aware of the function of its, you know, what it's doing to us and how it's working on us, right? Yeah, it reminds me of the of Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's The Undercommons, you know, this idea of creating networks of kind of underground networks of information and conversation, and kind of casual networks of reverse engineering pedagogy and rethinking the way that we learn, that are deeply antithetical to the institutions that exist at the moment. But how these undercommons are often happening within institutions or kind of parasitic upon them in specific ways. Have you read that? Does that resonate at all?
No, it does. I never read the book. I read some essays, and I don't know. In general, I'm not a good reader.
That's great. Yeah, I think I was definitely trying to kind of tease out a little bit about your different methodologies with thinking through that moment in Uruguay that you were able to do this critical reform, and you were able to do the reform as a result of, what was it, 1918, the Cordoba? Yeah. So can you explain what that is really briefly?
Well, in 1918, the news came to South America about the Soviet Revolution. And on the way, of course, a lot of translation happened. But in Cordoba, which is a northern city in Argentina, with a very strong university. At the time, it was a church university and an elite university. And the student body evolved. They already had, the year before, there had been a congress in Uruguay, actually, aiming at an international humanist student movement. And taken from that in Cordoba, then they decided to demand a serious change in the university. Among the demands was co-government by the students, use the university as a state within the state, that is, be autonomous without access of police or army, with control of their own budget, and committed to social change. All that was very clear, and it became a movement that went all over Latin America, bypassed Brazil for language reasons, but within 5 years it reached Cuba. It was very powerful in Peru, and in each country it stopped. It was like redigested and enriched, created a lot of free schooling, and university was to be free, and courses were to be relevant for the student body. So the co-government had influence on curriculum. So all that legwork was fertilized our ground. We didn't have to start from scratch. In the process, it also became very worker-oriented, and the student movement was hand in hand with worker unions. And so if there was a strike among workers, students immediately strike with them, and vice versa. And that created the phenomenal tradition in which students were aware that they were moderately mature intellectually, while they were not still or yet being corrupted by survival tensions, or not as much as they would after graduation. And the assumption was, as soon you graduate, you are corrupt. And that gave the responsibility for each generation during studies start for the next generation, so that the non-corruptive process would be continuous. And they could call up, a lot of leaders ended up in politics and ended up very corrupt. Okay, so the student body always was like a counterpoint to that. The art school was a secondary level school, not university level, and depended from the Ministry of Culture. It was highly involved in party politics. Faculty belonged to a political party, there were favors. The bureaucracy was incredibly complex, and students were students, and faculty was faculty. There was no co-government. So over 3 generations of students, that started maturing. Okay, the generation before mine started working on a curriculum and was the one that gave an anarchist bent to the school. And then my generation dealt more concretely with curriculum, and the generation after mine, with whom I worked, we worked together, became the one that implemented. So it was a more militant generation. So at some point, we sat in, took over the school, and demanded the removal of the director, who was really very, very conservative. And at that moment, the conservative faculty threatened to resign if the director wasn't reinstated. And at that point, we went to the student union and got help not to change the director. So de facto, the faculty resigned. And that happened a year after we had been absorbed by the university. So we had leverage. And suddenly we were university studies, which is funny. We abolished the degree, my generation. So I don't have a degree. I graduated, but without a degree. But it's basically a secondary degree, not a university degree. But on paper, it is a university degree because I slipped in 3 years of secondary studies into university level just by shifting. It was very useful. So that's the story. So we changed the curriculum. We stood for faculty searches. 3 of us got the position. And then in the change of the curriculum, we got other people into faculty positions. And then it became stagnant after 3-4 years. And it's only now starting to move, but now it's very difficult because now, see, the credit system is like a virus taking over every country. And the university accepts credit systems. So it forces the art school to have credits. And all that stiffens the process in a very difficult way. So we are discussing now how to change the curriculum there, but it's very slow, and I don't know, I haven't heard from the school in nearly a year, partly because of COVID, and I don't know what the situation is.
Yeah, this whole situation of accreditation,
Exactly.
the credential, it's so absurd for art schools in many ways. And it brings me to again, I mean, this may be redundant with other things you've said, but this idea of whether or not art can be taught, in what situations and in what capacities and modalities. I mean, you've outlined quite a few in your books, and you have different online teaching guides and museum educational resources you've created with other artists about ways in which we can kind of give students and artists the tools before they start working with the materials, the tools to see and think. Can you maybe just briefly, before we go into Q&A?
Yeah, I don't think you can teach people to be a Leonardo da Vinci or a Picasso, but you can at least unblock processes that allow people to use their imagination at full potential and make connections that they are being educated, they are not able to do. And so that, I think, you can teach, not by giving recipes, but by setting up open problems, open questions, or at least, let's say, problems with infinite answers, not problems with one answer. Training them that there are no mistakes, that only are solutions that don't have a problem yet to match. And therefore retro-engineer from what is called a mistake, see what problem fits it the best possible, and then coordinate both problems until they match. Now, that's something that in art, you don't even think about. You do it. But it's not an alchemist tool. It's a method. It's a discipline. It's just hidden from the average citizen. And I think that should be open. Art should be demystified and should be, I mean, we're now serving a very narrow power class. I don't know in percentage, but from the world population, it's minuscule. We act as if that's the truth, okay? And it's very insidious. I was discussing the other day with a friend, discussing Mondrian. Now, Mondrian really is a religious artist who had his theosophy, anthroposophy as a program and illustrated that program. Nobody knows the program. So we're faced with a formal solution to Mondrian's proposal. If you look at it as a formal solution, it's a quite primitive and stupid piece, okay? I mean, it's not, my son could do it, but it is a very trivial solution. And still, I like it. I can look at them around and spend time on it, okay? Which means that somehow the canon infiltrated in my mind and my feelings and is out of my control. I have to step out and really become very critical and deny my so-called instinct and irrational taste and realize that it's manufactured, that it's a consensus in which I'm part of, within my social class, within my intellectual class, which is very narrow. And if I show Mondrian to somebody that's totally out of the system, so there are a lot of tacit understandings among us that don't have to be explained and that make it work. And the art canon and the art industry bank on that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that they're always wrong, but at least we should be educated to challenge it and to be able to contribute to it. So the things, they're fine. I don't know how to define quality, but there are things which we vibrate correctly, and there are things we vibrate because we were educated to vibrate.
Mm.
How to figure that out, I don't know, but it's a challenge, it's a task we should at least confront, try to figure it out. And certainly not train other generations to continue it, at least make them critical, make them aware, this is a problem, okay?
Mm. So,
Which is the same, I mean, why do we eat dessert at the end of a meal if we like it best? So you have a situation in which, especially for a child, all the dishes before dessert are like a step ladder to reach the top. That's not natural, okay? That's a cultural internalization of a habit, which we don't challenge.
precisely. Yeah, these habits are definitely, I mean, they're becoming so indoctrinated right now. I'd ask that everyone who's asking questions right now to just keep your questions very short and one line, so it's very easy for me to read and repeat them. An anonymous attendee asks, questioning the idea that the only goal of an art education is to become a professional artist is an important first step. It may be that we just need to think about how we describe what can happen at an art school. Not quite a question, but what do you think about that?
Well, in this moment, you are a free thinker in kindergarten, and then during 10 years, you are trained not to be free. And then some people are, because they are good with their hands, are encouraged to do art, which was actually my case. And then some discover that there's more to it or not, but it's a waste of 10 years to get to that point.
Mhm.
And that seems like a betrayal of the people. And it is because there is a notion of that the artist has to be a professional. If not, you don't have the right to do it, because it's a leisure activity, it's a hobby, and you have to transcend leisure and hobby to make it work, preferably by profit, by making money, but at least by credibility. So the system is based on this filtering and not on developing individuals. So once you reach art school, you're back into kindergarten to some extent. You are free to think. Pedagogical systems are relatively open, or at least heresies are tolerated and not punished. But that is for your benefit. It only kicks back into society through the object, the product you manufacture, and it goes to your credit. So in terms of actually helping the community develop, it's minimal. So it's really a social issue more than an art issue, what we're discussing.
Absolutely. And this leads into this next question from another anonymous attendee who asks, what tools and practices can help create the necessary space to speculate? Which I think you've answered in many ways, but maybe rephrasing it again will help too.
I think you carry it with you. My best moments are during the shower. And it is because it's a moment in which I'm distracted, but not totally. And therefore, the noise of everyday demands is ruled out. So the space is open to have ideas. And that's something, again, that can happen anywhere in any moment to anybody. It's just that we are so trained to be efficient that we don't allow for those spaces.
Mm-hmm.
So I think uselessness is important. And somebody wrote a book about that I just read. I forgot the name. And ignorance is important. And unfunctionality is important. Those are all areas that help exploration. So we should identify them and use them as places to, if you want, the word is not good, but to colonize ignorance, to colonize uselessness, or to make a reservation so it's not touched by other people. But to do it not as a negative, to do it as a respectful area that you may learn from.
I like your recuperation of the idea of artistic imperialism too. Yeah.
Well, for me, it has a disadvantage. We're all amateurs in terms of specialized culture. But I think specialization should be taught together with despecialization. It's like programs on a computer come with uninstall features. So what you learn should be able to be unlearned, and that should be part of a curriculum. And so I now lost the track again.
It's okay. I can't wait so we can uninstall Zoom. That'll be very nice. But Harold Fletcher asks, Luis, can you describe your role in the Mercosur biennial?
Fighting with Fletcher. No, we had lots of discussions. And the role was, I was a so-called pedagogical curator. And what was notable about this was that together with the curator, who was Gabriel Pérez Barreiro, we started together from scratch. So it wasn't that he had an exhibition package that passed on to me how to deal educationally, but we planned together the whole biennial. And so we asked, for instance, artists to identify what problem were they trying to solve with their work, and then put the statement close to the work and had a table for the public to write comments about if the statement was in line with the solution proposed by the artist, and if not, why not? So that was a feedback for the artist, and it also was a way of starting an educational process where the public started educating the public. Those comments were displayed on the same little wall where the statement of the artist was. They were changed every couple of days. So the whole biennial ended up being an educational biennial. In fact, people called it the pedagogical biennial, which was a terrific title, but it wasn't ours. It was a popular thing. And then with schools, we circulated among the 50 cities in the state assignments that were taken from the statements of the artist as problems, but were not telling the work to the students. So the students had to generate work interdisciplinary. It didn't have to be art that solved the issue that was presented. And then they came to the biennial, where buses bring in people. And then they could recognize the problem and compare their own solution with that of the artist and decide who was better and why. So the public became, that was the idea, that the public became colleague with the artist and not a consumer. It was quite successful. I mean, about between 300 and 500,000 people came. And I mean, as many as Documenta, I think. And it was a very popular event. So that was my function.
That's marvelous. So many, I mean, just trickster. keeping us on our toes. Maria and Elena Gonzalez asks, what would be your ideal assignment for a first level sculpture class?
Well, first of all, define sculpture and justify the definition from all points of view. And then decide where is their action needed and how is the action separated from just finding. Okay, I mean, so ways the big contribution of Duchamp was to make art by designation, to point at something and say, this is art. And that became the ready-mades that then were messed up by the market. But in fact, the legacy was that the power of designating and not the aesthetics, which makes it all around how do you define things and who defines them, which again is a power situation. So I think, I mean, I'm not addressing Maria Elena's directly, but I think art in school, basically in early primary school, should not be based on crafts, should not be making collages or analyzing work of artists and see how you can do something in this style, but arbitrarily decide what is art and what is not art. So it's more like entering through curating. Then either make or find works that apply to the definition. And then the task is to convince the public that it is actually art. And with that, you go through the whole process of defining your own canon, of making or finding the object, of presenting it, of communicating, and of convincing. And then you understand the process. And then you go to a museum. See, how did they do it? And then you decide, they did it better, actually. Or, no, there's a flaw here or there. And then you learn the craft to do whatever you have to do. But the craft is really the packaging part. It's not the knowledge part. So how do you translate sculpture into a process of knowledge instead of a process of making? And I would say that's the first step. Did you like it?
We'll wait to hear, hopefully. That was fantastic. I have so many thoughts on that, but I'll keep going. Another anonymous attendee asks, how can we shift institutions about art education from equating art education and professionalism to open the pyramid structure for those outside of academia?
I don't think we can affect much art schools. I mean, it's like, how do you affect the steel industry? I wouldn't know how to answer that. But I do think that the solution is, one important solution, is to change the educational system from the bottom up. And then art school will have to follow one way or another. The way we are going, actually, art school will die. They all will close eventually. And museums will have to take over. Museums are not recognizing that. But that's why I think the museum is a school, which is something I'm pushing. They have to take responsibility. It's not a vault to maintain expensive stuff. It's a place that should, it's a church that should generate heretics.
Mm-hmm.
That's a function. It's not a church to make acolytes.
Galleries are tending into this spot now in the absence of museums, like Hauser and Wirth and all these others. Which kind of brings me to this next question from Anya asking, she says, I find it hard to see how this problem could be solved before a revolutionary class struggle situation. Do you think it's possible without that?
Look, one problem with revolution, which I always had been very sympathetic to, is that it operates on the basis of a very narrow clock. The definition of time for a revolution is a very narrow fragmentation of time. And it tends to be, okay, we succeed tonight and tomorrow morning everything is fine. So there's on top of that a drive to instant gratification. And then you have that usually a revolution creates leaders, and leaders tend to have an ego, and then the ego slowly takes over and everything goes to shit. So I'm not very hopeful. I mean, there are too many examples in the 20th century that proved that it doesn't really work. So I think we have to be more humble. We have to think that whatever we do today may have an effect 3 or 4 generations from today. And that doesn't mean that we should not be responsible, but on the contrary, we should be even more responsible so that whatever we do today does have an effect 3 or 4 generations from now. And it's not a matter of 1 or 10 or even, I don't know, 100 people. It's a matter of really slowly building up a change of course in the population. And yes, there's some fight needed. So you have to unseat some people and you have to refine democracy. I mean, it's times that in the US, you learn what democracy is. I mean, you seem just to have made a statement through the so-called founding fathers and then forgotten about the rest. And so working on it. And so it requires work. It requires, see it as a very long-term project that is ultimately a pedagogical project, that is not a national project, it's a community project. So I wish I could say, yeah, let's make a revolution and solve it. It's just, maybe I'm too old for that, I don't know.
I like this idea of long-term militancy, though, just embedded in every.
You know, there's a story which probably most people know, in which Chu Enlai, the Minister of Defense or Exterior for Mao, once was asked, so what's your opinion about the French Revolution? And he thought for a moment and said, I think it's too soon to tell. And that, I think, was a very wise answer.
Mm-hmm. Nicely said. So Benjamin de Kosnik asks, is permanence part of the problem? How can current Bay Area arts organizations be more useful for arts education as a lifelong practice instead of the current once and done model?
I think once and done models are a waste. I think we have to work with schools. Schools are relatively stable. Teachers last a long time, also relative. And work on a level in which students are still responsive. So I don't know what the expected answer to that question is, but it's funny, I'm working on a project a little bit suspended in this moment for the virus, but the Center of Photography in Uruguay has a project working with neighborhoods. And I'm helping coordinate the educational part. And we're working on neighborhood identity, which in Montevideo is very strong, much stronger than here. So neighborhoods have really, they're different for ethnic and social and history reasons. And the center was working primarily using cultural and sports centers as a hub. And I'm pushing them to use the school and to readjust the curriculum if we find friendly teachers or principals to focus on the neighborhood in terms of geography, in terms of demography, in terms of visuals, chemistry, geology, all the issues you learn as a discipline, disembodied from your environment, put it into the neighborhood. Why, when you cross a particular street, you suddenly are in a different neighborhood? Who puts that street there as a limit, okay? Which in turn leads you to, why is there a borderline between Uruguay and Brazil? Which is also a street, by the way, in many places. I always had the dream of standing with 1 foot in Uruguay, 1 foot in Brazil, and then take things off one pocket and putting into the other, and then go to jail for smuggling. But it didn't work. In any case, why are the names of the streets naming people who never were in the neighborhood? Why isn't the possibility of naming a street after memorable people that lived in the neighborhood, and so on? So it becomes a mixture of also mapping. Okay, make a map from school to home. What are the landmarks? What landmarks are there in another neighborhood that you would want in your own? Borrowed landmarks and so on, and have that kind of place. And that's actually very productive. And it elicits a creative drive in all levels, no matter what discipline. And it creates a metaphoric model to then check what's happening outside.
Yes, on this hyper-regional aspect. And that brings me, I'll take 2 more questions. How about, or how are you feeling?
How am I feeling?
Yeah.
No, I'm fine.
Okay, cool. All right. So my dear friend Tooth, we are both big fans of yours. And he says that during a recent talk you gave, I recall you briefly mentioning an idea you had at one point proposed to integrate studying the thoughts and actions of the Tupamaros into the curriculum of the Escuela Nacional de Bellas Artes, which I find very intriguing. I'm wondering if you could speak more on your ideas on that.
Okay, Tupamaros was the Uruguayan guerrilla movement, and it was formed mostly by intellectual students, anarchists and socialists, some art students, and it really started being anti-violent. And they were not after grabbing power, but after creating conditions so that people would take over. So they exposed corruption and did operations that were extremely popular among the population because they were very creative. So they were not after the military efficiency that normally a revolutionary group aims at, but they had a sense of aesthetics that added to the functionality. And if you read about the operations, they are like engineered like plays. Actually, the most memorable one was a funerary procession in which the caskets were full of arms, and the procession went into a small town and then took over the fireman place, the police station, and went to the banks. Okay, it went badly. I mean, people died, unfortunately. They forgot that patrol cars have radios. But besides that, it was aesthetically immaculate. Each person in that procession had an understudy in case the main person wasn't able to arrive. And at some point, I actually discussed it with somebody involved who had been the planner and who was a theater director before being a guerrilla. And I didn't know that. I mean, there was a coincidence. So you had that kind of, I don't know if you can call it art. It certainly was ingenuity, and it was creative on an unexpected level. And that, in certain ways, what you would do with Abbie Hoffman in the States, in which there was a showmanship that went way beyond the actual functionality of what he was doing, that made it a spectacle. And I think if you analyze the aesthetics of the 60s, you would have to deal with Abbie Hoffman. You cannot ignore him as belonging to a different discipline. And that was the same for the Tupamaros, in my point of view. So regardless if you agree with them or not, it's an element that was contributed to the general knowledge of the people. That was very important. It was particularly important in a population in which there was no art market of any importance, in which, I don't know, there was a market that would sustain maybe 3 or 4 artists and not more. So even the activity in art school was a waste. We were being educated in art school to get a grant and leave and benefit another system, okay? I had totally free education, and then I came to the States, which means the States had a free ride on education spent by Uruguay on me, on that investment. Anyway, in that context, the contribution of the Tupamaros, I thought was really very important. And for me, it was also important because it showed how politics could move into art and blur that strict borderline. And at the same time, in Argentina, there was something called Tucumanarde, which was a group of artists and intellectuals that had come from art and went into politics. And those two examples together created an area of osmosis in which people traveled in a free way. And that was a phenomenon that I think culturally was crucial. So in the book I wrote, I speak about that.
It's fascinating. And also fascinating that so many Tupamaros are now in government, have had governmental...
Well, that's another thing about the clock.
Mm-hmm.
You see, in the narrow clock, the Tupamaros were declared they lost, they were in jail, it's over, revolution don't work. And then 10 years, 20 years later, they're in government. So who lost? You know, it depends what brand of watch you're wearing on your wrist that determines victory or failure.
Precisely.
Something not well thought out there.
And that kind of brings me, I'm going to try to bridge 2 questions here. There's quite a few questions that I'm afraid we're not going to be able to get to. But one is about how to frame effective counter narratives that advocate for this kind of the value of unknowing, uselessness, non-directed imagination, without such arguments being co-opted for darker, more authoritarian narratives. And the other is kind of a challenge about this constant return that we've had in the conversation to these ideas of the 60s as being these kind of utopian ideas. And I know you have a very specific idea of utopianism and what utopias we're living in and whose utopias we're living in. So maybe we can talk a little bit about this idea of kind of the cynicism that we're in right now of perhaps good, perhaps productive cynicism, perhaps unproductive cynicism, but this idea of framing effective counter narratives and thinking about what utopian solutions are generative and what aren't.
Look, I grew up in a utopian generation. That is, we had a clear view of the future and worked towards it. And and I had big discussions with my son about that, who said I was authoritarian, utopias are authoritarian. And he was right. So I rethought that in the last few years. I mean, I always felt it was a process and that you never would reach utopia, because if you did, things would be perfect and would be very boring, and therefore wouldn't be utopia. So the allure of utopia was that you were not going to make it. But it's a good compass, so as long you're not imposing it, but you take care that it's only a process that is flexible enough so that other utopian searches can merge or challenge and change it. And the other thing is that utopia is really based on the past. It's built on a foundation of things you know, but you don't know the future, so you cannot prefigure or pre-construct what's going to happen, because that's where you're assuming a power that you shouldn't. So that set clear, I think we know, each one of us, in what world we would like to live, and we should fight for it without making it a dogmatic code to follow. But try to convince people, try to affect the consensus, try to disrupt the consensus so that it's open to change. Okay, there was a year ago, so I read an essay, scientific research about flocks of birds. I don't know why I read it, to be honest, but it turned out to be very interesting. And the team wrote about difference between consensus and receptivity, which is actually a very important distinction, which I never had thought about. And second, that in a flock, there is a leader who they call a stubborn agent, whose function is to identify predatory enemies or food sources or whatever, and work on the receptivity of the flock to follow for the protection of the flock in that direction. And then that creates a consensus, or it doesn't. And I felt that description is actually the description of a good artist, that we are stubborn agents that are trying to develop a receptivity that moves the consensus in the direction we believe in. But that's not a revolution, and that's not a dogmatic education to impose a utopia. That's just stimulating the community in a direction, knowing that it may or may not be successful, and be at peace with it, but at least feel good that you did your effort. So that's where the counter-narrative comes in, and that gives you the scale of the counter-narrative. And because it's a stubborn activity, permanence is important and not a done deal.
That's a beautiful note to end on. Thank you so much, Luis. This has been wonderful. And I hope, like we said, this is parasitically infecting everyone out there.